Today's essential question, which is number 1 out of 4. What are Charles Darwin's contributions to our understanding of evolution? Today we'll be focusing on Charles Darwin, not as though he's the only person to contribute to our understanding of evolution, but we'll be focusing specifically on his contribution. So today's essential question: what are Charles Darwin's contributions to our understanding about evolution? First left-hand column, we are in fact talking about Charles Darwin. So please put down Charles Darwin as your first left-hand column. There are millions of species on the earth. So many that scientists are not sure of the exact number. These species differ wildly in their appearance, ecology, and behavior. Yet, there are also so many common characteristics. So, where did all these species come from? This is a question that has occupied the minds of some scientists for hundreds of years. And for a long time, people thought species were created individually over very short periods of time. But by the early 19th century, many scientists were beginning to think that perhaps they had evolved slowly from common ancestors. This idea of biological evolution was something of a puzzle. What was the mechanism behind it? How long would it take? Was the Earth even old enough for the process to produce the species that were observed on Earth? Originally, scientists thought Earth was only a few thousand years old, but new discoveries in the developing science of geology were changing these ideas. Scientists discovered Earth has been around for at least millions of years, perhaps long enough for life to produce all the species on the planet. Into this era of exciting discoveries about deep time and ancient Earth came a young naturalist, and his name was Charles Darwin. He was an avid collector of beetles, and he was training to be a pastor when he was offered the opportunity for a trip around the world. He was invited to become the naturalist aboard a small British naval survey ship called the HMS Beagle. His job was to make observations of natural phenomena and collect plant and animal specimens on what was to become a 5-year voyage. The HMS Beagle took Darwin first to islands in the Atlantic and tropical South America. Here, for the first time, he saw the high biodiversity that can be found in the tropics. He began to ask himself where all the species he encountered came from. He came back to this question repeatedly as he made observations on his field trips. On his trips, he found fossils of ancient organisms no longer found on Earth. He found fossils of marine organisms in rocks thousands of meters above the Pacific Ocean. And on a visit to a small Pacific archipelago, known as the Galapagos Islands, he observed how the distribution of species differed between islands that were only a few miles apart. When he eventually returned home to England, he began to realize that there was evidence of processes that could begin to account for the origin of all of the world's species.
It was a world in transition. The Industrial Revolution was just beginning. In Britain, it seemed, all the world was opening to these engines of change. It was a time of big ideas and big men. There was Erasmus Darwin, a prosperous country physician, a published poet, a free thinker, and a champion of the new technology. His son, Robert, another man of influence and girth, followed him into medicine, and when Robert's second son was born, February 12, 1809, it was assumed he would be part of a third generation of country physicians. But Charles Robert Darwin was happier in the woods than the classroom. He preferred to be outdoors, hunting, bird watching, collecting, exploring.
Charles was in and out of country houses and barnyards, and he saw how people selected the best cattle and the best pigs and the best horses and bred from them to improve the quality of the stock. Later on, Charles would call this artificial selection. His own mother kept fancy pigeons, so Charles could see right at home that from a common rock pigeon, the kind you find in Trafalgar Square in England, you get all kinds of extraordinary breeds, Jacobins and Pouters and Nuns and like.
He abandoned his medical studies and wound up at Cambridge University, where he was to study for the ministry.
And that's when it first occurred to him that he could make his name in natural science. He could make better beetle collections than any of the beetle collectors. He came here to the River Cam and scouted along the banks and looked at the trees and pulled beetles out of the bark. He bested the lot of them.
Knowing full well that he was more interested in collecting bugs than saving souls, two of his professors recommended him for a voyage around the world. The refitted 90-foot warship named Beagle was to map the South American coast. It was the turning point in Darwin's life. Intended to last 2 years, it was 5 years before the Beagle returned. 5 years of collecting, observing, exploring, and writing. The most important stop for Darwin was the Galapagos Islands. This relatively young, isolated archipelago 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador was a naturalist's dream, a laboratory of evolution. In a feverishly busy 5 weeks, he followed seagoing iguanas and tracked tortoises that seemed to vary from island to island. He collected 13 different types of birds that all turned out to be finches, and 3 species of mockingbirds. The animals must have come to the islands from South America in the distant past, but these creatures varied remarkably from their mainland ancestors.
Darwin was amazing. He was 27 years old when he got off the Beagle. His notebooks were bulging with data about all the places he had visited. He had enormous collections.
In addition to adding to his beetle collection, he gathered 1,500 species preserved in alcohol, 4,000 skins, bones, and dried specimens, crates and crates of fossils. He returned with 3,000 pages of notes on entomology, geology, paleontology, and zoology. He was the toast of London's scientific community. Even his father was finally impressed. Darwin married 2 years after his return, laying out his options as he might a tray full of bugs. On a scrap of paper, he listed the arguments for and against marriage. In the pro column were children, someone to take care of the house, and companionship. It would be better than a dog anyhow. On the con side of the ledger, he listed the lack of freedom, quarreling, loss of time, and less money for books. Marriage won out, in spite of the consequences. He married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, because, he wrote, she was an angel and had money. They moved to a small estate 20 miles south of London and lived at Down House for the rest of their lives. Eventually, they had 10 children, but only 7 survived to adulthood.
When Darwin returned to England in 1836, and he spent the next 22 years collecting evidence that would eventually lead to his theory of natural selection. He was reluctant to publish because his ideas would conflict with religious ideas that were prevalent at the time. But then, in 1858, he received a letter from another naturalist, Alfred Wallace, who had come up with similar ideas about how evolution occurred. Darwin and Wallace's work was immediately presented to the scientific community. A year later, Darwin published a book that gave details of his theory. The book was called On the Origin of Species, and its first printing sold on the first day it was published. Although at first considered controversial, the ideas in the book eventually became accepted by the scientific community. Central to these ideas was his mechanism for evolution that he called natural selection. At this point, you should be able to generate an answer to today's essential question, which is, What are Charles Darwin's contributions to our understanding of evolution? Please press pause on the video and write your answer to today's essential question in the summary box at the bottom of your notes now.